Hi, this is Mr. Evans. This video is going to look at Edexcel Paper 1 exam and Paper 1 and Paper 2 exam technique. So the first thing I'm going to say is that it's a 2-hour exam. The exam paper is split exactly in two. Okay, so you've got 1 hour per section unless you've got extra time. If you've got extra time, you need to know exactly how long that you've got. That's half the paper, because it's much better for you to answer every question than do the perfect answer to section 1 and then you leave yourself less time for section 2. I'd rather my students answered every single question. Okay, on that, I also would suggest that you know which order you're planning to answer the questions before you go in. So what I mean by that is, are you going to answer the questions in order, the 2 4 marks, then the 10, and then the 12, and then the 20, which is absolutely fine. Some of my students in the past have opted for starting with the 2 4 markers to get themselves warmed up, skipping straight to the 20, and then doing the 12 and then doing the 10 last. It does make sense if you think about it to do the 12 before the 10, because essentially they are one and the same really, and you get 2 extra marks for the 12 marker. Occasionally in the examiner's report they have the fairly unhelpful advice of, in the 12 marker you need an extra chain of analysis. In the exam that doesn't mean anything to you, because what does an extra chain of analysis mean? Okay, it doesn't mean anything. Treat 10 and 12 markers as the same, and if that's the case, then you should prioritise finishing the 12 marker because there's 2 extra marks there. Okay, so I've already covered completing the paper rather than giving the perfect answer to a question. It's much better to pick up, 9s, 8 out of 10 and a 10 out of 12, etc., than leave an entire question blank. It's really important to plan your answer to the longer questions. You might be tempted just to dive in and get going, but taking a minute or two just to bullet point plan your main points and what your conclusion is going to be to the 10, 12, 20 mark questions is going to make your answers to those questions much, much better. And the examiner's reports for AQA for Edexcel are really, really good. So make sure you've seen them. I'll show you one in a minute, but often on those high scoring answers, you will see that the student has just bullet pointed a few ideas. It doesn't have to be long, but it keeps you focused. By the time you get to the exam, I want my students thinking about business and not paragraph structure. So what do I mean by that? So teachers often give their students a particular format for writing a paragraph, if that's PEAL or PBLT or Maliba or PEACH. There's all sorts of acronyms. The examiner has none of that in front of them. Right? What the examiner has got in front of them is a mark scheme that looks like this. All right, so this is the mark scheme for a 10-mark question. They've just got business in front of them, and then they've got a marking ladder. There's nothing that says, you've got to have your therefore before your leads to. I don't want my students thinking of any of that. They're really helpful, those acronyms, when you're starting to write. But by the time you get to the exam, I want my students thinking about explaining business and not the paragraph structure, okay? Because then you're going to do a much better answer if you're worrying about the technicalities of writing the paragraph. So think about business, forget all of that stuff now. You're in the exam. You just need to explain clearly your point to the examiner. Okay, and if you're short on time, okay, if you're coming up on the end of the exam, prioritize your conclusions, right? So you want to show the examiner knowledge, application, analysis, and evaluation. The bulk of the evaluation marks are in the conclusion. So if you've done one really good paragraph in favour of something, just do a brief however. And that allows you to show the examiner that you've assessed both sides of the option, and then you come up with your conclusion. Okay, so if you're short on time, go do a very short however, and then you're on to your conclusion. Okay, the 4-mark questions, calculations, they're great. Just show your workings. Okay, if you go wrong, then you can still pick up marks. If you've shown your workings, right, you can get 3 out of 4 even with the wrong answer. If you just put the answer and it's wrong, even if the examiner knows what your mistake was, they can't award it because you're not showing your workings. In the explain questions, okay, 1 knowledge, 2 application, 1 analysis marks. The 2 application marks, try and be specific from the case study. Try and lift 2 things exactly from the case study. You're really just trying to show the examiner, look, give me my application marks. So lift it straight from the case study, then they can't deny you your application marks. All right, start with the definition for the knowledge, and then your analysis marks is simply explaining. So they're nice, those 4-mark questions, if you know how to do it. Okay, so 10 and 12 mark questions. All right, so the command word in a 10 or a 12 mark question, I've picked out the 10 and 12 mark questions from 2023 paper 2. Right, the command word is assess. Assess means look at both sides of the argument. Okay, so that's what you've got to do. The simplest way that works in nearly every 10 or 12 mark question is simply to talk about pros and cons, or for and against. Okay, just look at both sides of the argument. If you're doing pros and cons, you don't need to do pro, however, con, however, because you just don't need to do it, right? You just do pro and then cons, because if you do pro, however, you'll think you're doing pro con. And then if you do con, however, you're doing con pro. Okay, you don't need to do that. Just pros and cons, for and against. What you could sometimes do, you could talk about benefit 1, however, benefit 2, however, factor 1, however, factor 2, however. Okay, but essentially all you're trying to do is present both sides of the argument. So here's the 10 and 12 mark questions from 2023. Let's have a look at them and see how we can apply these. Right, assess whether the distinctive capability of innovation is the main reason that Brompton has a competitive advantage. So in this question, we're being asked if this is the source of their competitive advantage. And basically, we need to present both sides of the argument. So it is innovation. I would contrast that it is another factor and be led by the case study for that other factor. You could put howevers at the end. You don't have to. Okay. Using the data in Extract C, assess the effect on Brompton sales. Okay, so that's what we're being asked to assess of a change in the US dollar. Okay, so it could have got stronger or weaker, it doesn't matter. In this case, it's either going to have a positive effect on Brompton sales or a negative effect. Definitely don't need howevers, right? Because you're covering both sides of the argument. So the paragraph 1, it's going to be positive. Paragraph 2, it's going to be negative. And then you look for your application in the case study. Okay, the bold here hasn't come from the examiner. Hasn't come from me, it's come from the examiner. Okay, assess one likely effect of consumer protection legislation on Peloton. So that implies to me that you could just talk about here's a benefit with a however. Okay, basically it's effect 1, okay, positive or negative. That's in theory how to answer it. Okay, this is a very unusual wording of the question, though. That's way out of whack. Okay, so it says one likely effect. So in theory, you can just talk about one thing. But benefit 1, however, benefit 2, however, actually worked in the real thing, despite the fact that they said 1. And look, there it is. This is the examiner's report. So I've got a model answer here. And it says here, this 8 mark, it considered both negative and positive effects of the legislation. Okay, so it just did pros and cons, basically, and you can read it. It's pros, paragraph 1, cons, paragraph 2. It's available online if you want to have a look, but it got 8 marks either way. So just think pros and cons, paragraph 1, paragraph 2. Okay, assess whether cutting costs is the best way to improve profit. It is cutting costs. It is something else. All right, so you be guided by the question, be guided by the case study, but just make sure you present both sides of the argument in your 10 and 12 marker. In terms of a conclusion, the basics, you answer the question and you justify your answer using the case study. So the exam board recommends mentioning MOPS, so that's the market. Is it competitive? What are the business's objectives? Okay, can you find them? What about the product? Is it high tech? Is it low cost? Is it, is there something unique about the product? Pick it up from the case study. Situation covers pretty much every aspect of a business, right? But the key point here is that you are using application from the case study, something specific about the business, to justify your conclusion. Okay, so that's the basic conclusion: answer and justify using the case study. You can extend your conclusion in various ways. You can think about short and long-term impact. Students have a great deal of success with this. You could say, what's the biggest problem and how can that be solved? So you could say, well, I think that the business should do this. However, it has this problem, but despite this problem, I still think they should do it because it can be solved in this way. Okay, so that is a way of extending your conclusion. Or you could say what it depends on. All right, both MOPS and these ways of extending your conclusion, you probably wouldn't look to do more than one. Okay, because you don't have time, and also you don't need it. You look at the examiner's reports, conclusions are generally pretty simple, okay? But it's good to have a range of methods to conclude up your sleeve, all right? So all of them can work. It depends how well you do any of them. Looking at the examiner's reports will help you to see what's worked for students in the past. Okay, the 20 marker. Discuss the pros and cons of each option. In this case, you definitely the 20 marker, as you'll probably know, gives you an objective, usually, and you have to look at the pros and cons of each option. All right, in this case, it's a bit different. It asks you to evaluate 2 PESEL factors and recommend which one PESEL should prioritise. So in this case, you'd look at factor 1, why it's important, and then, however, why it's not that important. Factor 2, why it's important, then why it might not be that important. And the answer is which one is most important when developing future corporate strategy. Okay, but that's what basically we're trying to do. Look at the reasons for, reasons against of each option. If you're short on time, keep the however really brief. You do need to do that, however, because the wording of the question is that you have to evaluate these 2. So that means present both sides of the argument of each option. The conclusion, you want to explain which one you pick and why, and mention why not the other. Okay, and use MOPS. All that means, all MOPS is saying is use the case study. It should be something specific from the case study. How do you know you've done it? You've got something in your case study that you could not, in your conclusion, that you could not have written if you'd not used the case study. So good luck in your paper 1 and paper 2 exams. They're always the same. I hope that they go really well for you.